is written in the United States Constitution that there must be a separation between church and state. It's a long-standing controversial topic that has stirred debate during presidential elections going far back as John F. Kennedy. Well, here in studio to share a little bit about the controversy about church and state are political science professors Marriah and Judy Duncker, and they're here in studio. We thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Pleased to be here.
As we see the talk about church and state, we know that it's becoming a big thing in the 2008 primaries, and as we move on to see who our next president of the United States is going to be. It's been something that's going on for years, and some people say it's pretty defined. Some people say there's a large gray area. How would you interpret the separation between church and state as we see it today? And I'll start off with President Ryan.
Well, the separation between church and state is very strong. The question is there a separation between church and society? Because, as you just said, there is no constitutional religion requirement. You do not have to be a Christian or a Catholic or a Muslim or any religion to hold public office. But, despite that, people want to know that you share some values, you share a faith, you share some beliefs. And when it comes to voting, people want to vote for someone like them. They want to vote for someone who they think has a certain set of priorities, who worships maybe the same God or a similar God even. So the church and state separation is very important, but what you find is people voting for increasingly people who are more like them in terms of their orientation, and not just for someone who is a generic candidate.
Professor Duncker, if you could share with us what exactly would define separation between church and state, if you would?
For me and my interpretation of the Constitution, the suggestion is that the political system and the government should not impose its values on a particular religion, on one's belief system. However, we have somehow come to move from that earlier notion of separation in church and state to a belief that religious people or the church should not get involved in politics, which I believe is sort of a new approach to this that I do not find present in the Constitution, and I do not think that that was the original reason why that statute was initially imposed.
And you have no opposition of the church being involved in politics?
It's not a matter of opposition. It's a matter of the reality of life. Churches are now becoming extremely involved in politics, and I think that involvement comes from the fact that politicians are going to the church to get votes, because the church is now beginning to aggregate in a way that it has never done before. We are seeing mega churches all over the United States, and politicians are seeing
the first Catholic candidate for President, Al Smith, 1924, the first candidate to win the presidency, John F. Kennedy, 1960. So we have this trend that politicians are expected to profess beliefs. Now, what you have recently, this is only in the past 30 years, is a trend among Christian conservatives that if you look at the founding fathers, they say, well, they were Christians. They wanted the politicians to believe in Jesus Christ, to believe in God. This is a belief that has been gaining increasing currency in the past 30 years, especially in the past 10 years. Because what you have here, as Professor Duncker said, is witnessing politicians who are separating themselves from the church, separating themselves from society. So what Christians want now is the inclusion of religion in the public sphere, the inclusion of God in the public sphere. Because what they've seen is the state trying to take out, the
removal of prayer in schools.
Exactly. Or the presence of God in the Pledge of Allegiance, the presence of God on coins, God we trust.
Right.
So the separation of church and state is critical, but it's a question of values. Does someone who is a Christian have values? And the question could be asked of atheists, people who are spiritual. That's the real test here. Does being a Christian mean you are honest? Mean you are trustworthy? Mean you are charitable? is that kind of question is difficult to answer.
When we see church and state, as we see, and I think you alluded to earlier, you talked a little bit about how politicians flock to the mega churches. They're involved in the mega churches. They go to, not even the mega churches, but they go to the, you know, the little ones as well. But this is a growing trend because earlier on, we wouldn't hear of politicians necessarily entering into houses of worship for the solicitation of votes. Talk to us about when did the tide start to turn that we started to see politicians really say, okay, listen, church, I got to be there if I want to get a vote.
I think it started in, well, in the African American community, what I've noticed is because of voter turnout is so low in urban areas, one of the strategies that politicians have used is to try to solicit the support of African American leaders and leaders of minority groups to try to get that additional dimension. So at one point in our history when the voter turnout began to decline, we saw that as a strategy to try to increase minority participation by using the church as a strategy. And of course, in other communities, majority communities, Caucasian communities, we saw where the large churches, which initially developed in Caucasian communities, also the strategy was extended to that particular group to try again to elicit additional votes for politicians.
I was talking with a staffer of a high-ranking White House official, and they were saying to me that when it comes to the issue of church and state, one of the things that was shed to light about the church was how, church and state was how politicians became involved was when they recognized, particularly in the 60s, how a lot of the major movements, particularly in the African American community, came through the church. The Million Man March, the civil rights, the March on Washington, even voter registration. At some point, did the church change its values? Do you feel that the church changed its values, or was the church really holding true to its values by engaging in the political realm?
Well, the church hadn't changed its values. It's just that the state became more responsive to the needs of African Americans after the civil rights movement. And so the church sort of relaxed. It no longer had the burden of fighting for African Americans and fighting for people of color because the state now had assumed that role. So I believe what occurred in the political community was they saw another opportunity to get the involvement of the church by now asking to gain votes.
I actually disagree with that.
Okay.
What you have is a very strong debate starting in the 60s of what is the proper role of the church in society. You have Vatican II with the Catholic Church. You have liberation theology with the Protestant Church. And those two forces, you know, they're liberating forces on the one hand, but you had a very strong reaction from Protestants in the Christian society in the U.S. saying, well, if they're going to be pushing social justice, as Martin Luther King was doing, or as other Catholic ministers were doing, well, we want to maintain order, we want to maintain doctrine. And so what's happened is that there has become this new movement to establish doctrine, to establish very strict guidance, strict adherence. So there's this, as I mentioned before, Christian Reconstructionism, talking about the notion that the U.S. is a Christian society, talking about fundamental values, evangelical Christians. So people are trying to hold on to values that they think are being taken away from them.
All right, well, we have to separate for a quick second because we got to give our viewers an opportunity to take a quick break. And when we come back, the issue is being discussed about church and state. We're going to continue that discussion when Open returns right after this.
Kings of the Bronx present